You let me sleep in your bed, rancher. Get ready. We're having babies, said the Apache fugitive woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind from the Wyoming foothills pushed across the open land with a steady, cold force that made every fence board creak and every barn hinge stiffen. Harlan Boone had lived through enough winters to know when a storm would settle in for days, and the way the clouds hung low over the ridge told him this would be one of those nights. He tightened his coat, lifted the lantern higher, and walked the line between the barn and the corral, checking each gate with slow, practiced movements that came from years of living alone on this stretch of land. He was 39, broad-shouldered, and worn down in ways that didn't show unless someone looked closely. After losing his younger brother during a land dispute that turned violent, he had left town life behind and built this place on his own. No family visited. No neighbors stayed long. He preferred it that way. Work kept his mind from sliding back into memories he didn't want. As he walked toward the barn to close it for the night, he tried to quiet the familiar tightness in his chest, the old feeling that something could still go wrong even in silence. Just as he reached for the door latch, he heard a faint sound carried by the wind. It wasn't an animal cry or the groan of wood. It was sharper, thinner, and almost swallowed by the storm. He stopped immediately. Another sound followed, soft, broken, like someone trying to breathe through pain. He lowered the lantern and followed the noise around the back corner of the barn. The snow was deep there, untouched except for a narrow set of uneven tracks leading toward the far wall. He crouched down as soon as he saw her. A young Apache woman lay collapsed in the snow, her body curled tight against the cold. Her skin had lost its warmth. Her lips were pale, and her feet were bare and scraped from running over frozen ground. He saw instantly that she had been through something violent. Her deerskin dress was torn across the chest, the neckline pulled wide from rough handling, the tear exposing the curve of her chest and the dark bruising along her shoulder. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her hair was tangled with frost. She looked like she had forced herself forward until she couldn't take another step. Harlan felt a sudden jolt of worry he hadn't felt in years. His first instinct, almost automatic, was to check if anyone was nearby, but the ridge was empty and the storm swallowed every track except hers. When he touched her arm, she flinched so hard it almost knocked her sideways. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice steady so she wouldn't panic. She tried to pull away, but her strength was gone. Her fingers trembled violently, and her eyes opened only partway before closing again. The fear in her face was sharp and clear. She wasn't afraid of the cold. She was afraid of whoever had been chasing her. He didn't ask questions. The cold would kill her long before she could explain. With slow, careful movements, he slid one arm behind her back and the other under her legs. She was light, far too light for a grown woman, and the way she stiffened against his chest told him she wasn't used to being touched without harm. He adjusted his grip so her torn neckline stayed covered under his coat and carried her toward the cabin with long, direct strides. Inside, the heat from the fire softened the air. The cabin was small, one bed, one table, one stove, one chair, but it was warm and safe. He kicked the door shut behind him and lowered her onto the bed, placing her near the center so she wouldn't roll off if she panicked in her sleep. The quilt was thick and heavy, made from wool and old shirts he had stitched together years ago, and he wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, leaving only her face exposed. Her eyes fluttered open. She tried to sit up, but the moment she looked at him, the fear rose again. Her hand shot to the torn neckline of her dress, pulling the quilt upward to protect herself. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. She watched him, breathing fast and unsteady, waiting for a sign that she had misjudged him. But he stepped back instead of closer. He moved to the hearth and lifted another log into the fire, his back turned so she wouldn't feel looked at or cornered. Her mind raced. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know if she had escaped the man who tried to trade her. She didn't know if this stranger would hand her back. Every muscle in her body ached from running. Her throat burned from cold air. She could barely feel her fingers. She scanned the cabin, checking every shadow, waiting for something sudden. Harlan felt her eyes on him. He knew the look. He had seen that kind of fear before in people who had lost more than they could say. He kept his movements slow and predictable. He poured water into a tin cup and set it at the edge of the table where she could reach if she wanted. He didn't ask for her story. He didn't demand answers. He only said, "Drink when you can," then returned to the chair by the fire. Minutes passed with only the crackle of wood and the low whistle of wind outside. She breathed unevenly at first, then slower as her body warmed. The quilt rose and fell around her chest, covering the torn dress completely. Harlan stayed alert. He didn't allow his eyes to linger on her or her injuries. He kept his focus on the fire, listening for every shift in her breathing. The responsibility of another life settled onto him with a weight he hadn't felt since his brother died. He didn't know her circumstances, but he understood enough. She had been running for her life. Eventually she spoke, her voice faint and rough. "Tala," she whispered. He lifted his head slightly. "Tala," he repeated, making sure he said it correctly. She nodded once. That was all she had strength for. "Harlan," he said, "this is my place. You're safe tonight." The word safe caught her off guard. She looked at him longer this time. Her eyes stayed cautious, but something in her expression softened, just enough to show she wanted to believe him. She wasn't sure how she had ended up in this small cabin with a stranger. She only remembered breaking free from the men who held her, running barefoot over frozen ground until her legs gave out. She thought she would die in the snow. Instead, she woke in a bed with warmth around her and a man who hadn't taken advantage of her vulnerability. Harlan saw exhaustion settle into her face. He didn't try to speak further. He reached over to adjust a draft stopper near the shutter, then sat back down. He had kept himself alive out here through discipline and habits, and tonight he would keep a stranger alive the same way. By the time dawn crept through the shutters, Tala was still breathing evenly, her cheeks warming back to color. The storm had passed, leaving the land covered in clean, heavy snow that reflected pale morning light across the cabin interior. She opened her eyes again. This time she didn't flinch. She slowly sat up, holding the quilt to her chest, and looked at him with a clear gaze. Harlan stood near the stove, making coffee with slow movements, giving her room. He looked tired but steady, as if staying awake all night had been nothing more than another chore. For the first time since her escape, Tala felt her heart slow enough to think beyond the next moment. She was alive. She was indoors. The man in the cabin had not touched her except to carry her out of the cold. And for reasons she didn't understand yet, she trusted him more than anyone she had met in months. In that small cabin surrounded by snow, two strangers with damaged pasts faced the same quiet truth. Neither of them had expected company. Neither of them had asked for it. But fate had brought them into the same room, and neither stepped away from the moment that followed. The morning settled into the cabin with a quiet that felt different from the night before, not only because the storm had eased, but because Tala was awake enough to notice every detail around her. She lifted the quilt slightly, checking her feet, her arms, and the torn edge of her dress, as if trying to confirm she still had control over her own body. Her eyes moved across the small room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the single table, the neatly stacked wood by the stove, and the one chair Harlan had used while she slept. She noted how each object had a clear purpose, arranged by someone who lived alone and needed everything in its place. Harlan stood by the stove, heating water, his back turned to give her as much privacy as the cabin allowed. He didn't look over when she shifted, though he clearly registered every sound she made, ready to help if she struggled. He had spent the last decade keeping to himself, building routines that kept his life predictable, and now he found himself adjusting those routines without complaint because her safety mattered more than the quiet he had built. Tala's stomach clenched with hunger, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since the day before she escaped. She hesitated to speak, unsure how her voice would sound after the cold, but she forced herself to try. "Is anyone else here?" she asked softly. Harlan glanced toward her. "Just us." She watched his face carefully, trying to see if he was hiding anything, but his expression stayed steady. He wasn't the type to soften his words for comfort. He just gave a truth plainly. She swallowed hard. "You live alone?" "For years," he answered, turning back to the stove as the water began to steam. The certainty in his tone eased one of the questions that had lingered in her mind all night. Whether more people might enter the cabin, whether someone else had a claim over the space she woke up in. Knowing he was alone changed the tightness in her shoulders. Still, she needed to understand something else before she dared relax fully. "How did you find me?" she asked. "You were beside the barn," he said, stirring the pot on the stove. "Looked like you pushed yourself until you couldn't keep moving." Tala lowered her eyes. She remembered running, falling, dragging herself back up because stopping meant being caught. She remembered voices behind her, shouts muffled by distance, the pounding fear that someone would grab her again. She remembered the moment her legs refused to hold her weight anymore. But she didn't remember how close to shelter she had come. "You could have left me there," she whispered, not accusing him, but stating the truth plainly. "I wasn't going to do that," he replied, and the way he said it carried no pride and no expectation of gratitude. It was simply what he believed. Harlan poured water into a tin cup and walked it to the table nearest her. He kept a respectful distance, but made sure she saw where he placed it. When he stepped back, she reached forward slowly, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the instinctive fear that any movement near a stranger might bring harm. When nothing happened, no sudden reach, no demand, no threat, her shoulders eased again. Her voice came quieter this time. "What do you want me to do?" "Just rest," he said. "We'll figure the rest out when you're steady." The worry surprised her more than anything. She had been alone for months, moving from danger to danger with no idea where safety could be found. Hearing him place himself in the same sentence as her made something shift inside her chest, uncomfortable but not unwelcome. As she drank, he prepared food, simple beans warmed over the stove with salt and a bit of leftover pork. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, and Tala watched him closely, trying to read the small details she hadn't noticed the night before. He had a quiet way of breathing when he worked. His hands showed old scars, not fresh ones. His shoulders curved slightly forward, the posture of a man used to labor, not conflict. She finally asked the question she had been too scared to voice earlier. "Are they coming here?" He paused at the stove, the spoon motionless for a moment. "Oh, the men," she said, tightening her grip on the quilt. "The ones who try to take me." He set the spoon down and turned to face her fully for the first time since she had woken. His jaw tightened in a way that showed he didn't like what he was imagining. "Why were they after you?" Her breathing sped up again, but she forced herself to answer. "They wanted to sell me. I got away yesterday. I ran all night. I thought I lost them, but I don't know." Harlan let out a slow breath, absorbing the information without reacting impulsively. In his mind, he began measuring distances. How far she could have run, how close the men might still be, how much time they had before tracks disappeared under new snow. He didn't say any of this aloud, but Tala saw the change in his face. He wasn't indifferent. He was planning. "You're safe here for now," he said. "But if someone's looking for you, we need to be ready." That statement brought another thought into her mind, one she dreaded. "You won't get me back, will you?" He shook his head once, firm and decisive. "No." Her breath moved out of her chest in a long, shaky release. She didn't smile, but her expression softened with relief so deep it almost overwhelmed her. For weeks, she had lived in survival mode, trusting no one, waiting for the next threat. Hearing his certainty felt like stepping inside a wall she didn't know she needed. Harlan lifted the pot from the stove and filled a bowl. He carried it to her and set it on the bedside table. "Eat what you can." The smell of warm food hit her immediately, and her stomach cramped again. She took the bowl with careful hands and began eating in slow, small bites. Harlan stepped back to give her space, leaning against the wall near the stove while she focused on each mouthful, as if relearning the meaning of nourishment. "What about you?" she asked when she noticed he hadn't made a second bowl. "I'll eat later," he said. "You need it first." Another detail sank in. He was prioritizing her without announcing it. He wasn't grand about it. He simply made sure she survived. Tala lowered the spoon and looked at him for a long time, memorizing the shape of the man who had changed the course of her life in one night. She still didn't know why he lived alone. She didn't know why he kept his words short or why he moved as if some old memory weighed on him. But she understood one thing clearly. He was dangerous only to those who meant her harm. Outside, the cold light shifted across the snow. Inside, something unspoken formed between them, built entirely on instinct, shared fear, and the first fragile traces of trust. Tala tightened the quilt around her shoulders. Harlan crossed his arms and looked toward the window with a protective stillness she hadn't seen in anyone for years. Neither said it aloud, but both understood. If the men returned, they would not find her alone. The cabin held a different kind of quiet after Tala finished her first real meal in days. She leaned back against the wooden headboard, still wrapped in the quilt, her breathing steadier but her mind racing with questions she hadn't dared ask before. Harlan moved around the room with a measured pace, putting the pot back on the stove, placing the spoon near the basin, and checking the firewood pile. Every movement signaled a man returning to routine, yet she noticed he paused more often now, listening for sounds outside or glancing toward her to make sure she hadn't grown faint again. The daylight creeping through the shutters sharpened the details Tala hadn't been able to see during the storm. The way Harlan kept his boots neatly by the door, the rifle resting on a wall rack within reach, the patches on his coat stitched carefully by hand, the single set of mugs and plates on the shelf. She realized the life he lived wasn't only quiet. It was built for one person, with no expectation of company. Her presence disrupted that, and she wondered if it troubled him. He sensed her watching and finally asked, "You feeling steady?" "Better than before," she said, adjusting her grip on the quilt. The warmth had returned to her limbs, but her nerves stayed tight from the question she'd been holding back since dawn. "Are we too close to the trail they found me on?" Harlan walked to the window and moved the shutter just enough to check the ridge. The snow outside was smooth and untouched except for the faint line of his own tracks from the night before. "Your prints were almost filled in when I found you," he said. "Storm wiped most of it clean." He lowered the shutter again without letting cold air rush in. "If they were following you, they'll have a hard time staying on a covered trail." His calmness steadied her nerves, but a new concern rose. "If they come here and see smoke, they'll know someone lives close. They'd have no reason to check this far west unless they already saw where you went," he replied. "You were heading in the right direction without knowing it. This land gets empty the further you go." His explanation answered a question listeners might have wondered: why Harlan was so certain danger wouldn't barge into the cabin immediately. Tala absorbed his reasoning, realizing she hadn't even been aware of the direction she ran. She'd been moving blindly, driven only by fear and instinct. "Do you think they'll keep looking?" she asked. He crossed his arms and leaned one shoulder against the wall, considering her words carefully. "Men who trade people don't quit easy. They see it as losing something they think they own. But they don't know who you're with now or what ground they're stepping onto." The protective certainty in his tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight that steadied her heartbeat. When the silence stretched, Harlan walked toward the chest at the foot of the bed and opened it, taking out one of his old flannel shirts. He hesitated for a moment, then placed it on the chair closest to her, without handing it directly to her. "Your dress needs fixing," he said. "You'll be warmer in this for now." She stared at the shirt, surprised. "You're giving me your clothes?" "You need something that isn't torn," he said simply. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. For weeks she had slept in fear, eaten next to strangers who waited for any sign of weakness, and fled through darkness with nothing but the torn dress on her back. Someone offering her clothing without expecting anything in return felt unfamiliar in a way that made her chest ache. She reached for the shirt slowly, checking his face for any sign of discomfort. "I can put it on if you turn away." He nodded and stepped to the other side of the room, facing the stove, giving her complete privacy. That single act answered another silent question: whether he intended to take advantage of her vulnerability. The answer was clear. He wanted nothing from her except her safety. Tala slipped the quilt aside just enough to pull the shirt over her head. The fabric was soft from years of washing, smelling of pine smoke and cold air. It hung low on her, covering what the torn dress couldn't. She buttoned the front with shaking fingers, grateful for something whole on her skin. "You can turn back," she said once she was covered. Harlan faced her again and noticed the change instantly. "That's better," he said, not in a way that commented on appearance, but on the fact that she looked warmer, steadier, and less exposed. She pulled her knees up slightly under the quilt. "Why do you live out here alone?" Harlan took a breath, the kind that carried weight from memories he didn't revisit often. He sat in the chair near the door, resting his hands on his knees. "Lost my brother 10 winters ago. Fight over land went wrong. Town didn't feel like somewhere worth staying after that." He didn't shift or avert his gaze. He simply stated the truth, even the painful parts. "I came out here because I needed quiet." Tala listened, absorbing not only the words but the way he said them, steadily, without seeking sympathy. His reason for isolation clarified the distance in his eyes, the way he moved through life with deliberate caution, and why he never reached for her too quickly. "So your mission now is just surviving?" she asked. "For a long time it was," he admitted. "Fixing what breaks, growing what I can, keeping to myself. Wasn't planning on anything different." Her eyes lowered as a thought pressed against her chest. "And now?" He looked at her with a seriousness that carried no hesitation. "Now someone showed up on my land, needing help. That changes what I do next." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to claim responsibility so openly. Before either of them could speak again, a distant sound rose outside, a muffled thud, almost like something hitting the snow near the fence. Harlan froze, listening with the alertness of a man who recognized danger by sound alone. He lifted the rifle from the rack, not panicked, but focused, scanning the door frame and the window, as if mapping out possibilities in his head. Tala held the quilt tight around her shoulders, her entire body bracing for the possibility of pursuit. "It came from a north side," Harlan said quietly. "Could be an animal. Could be someone moving where they shouldn't." Her heartbeat quickened. "Do we hide?" "You stay here," he said firmly. "I'll see who's close." Tala nodded, trusting him without question. He stepped to the door, pulled his coat on, and checked the rifle once more before opening the door, just enough to slip outside. The cold rushed in briefly, then disappeared as he shut it behind him. Inside, Tala sat perfectly still, listening to the silence that followed. Every breath she took was careful and tense. But beneath the fear was something new. She wasn't facing danger alone anymore. Outside, Harlan moved through the snow with quiet precision, following the sound toward the fence line. Whatever waited out there would determine the path the two of them took next. And inside the cabin, Tala understood that her life had already changed the moment she collapsed in the snow. Harlan stepped out into the cold with the rifle held low but ready, the weight familiar in his hand as the wind pressed against his coat and the snow compacted quietly under his boots. The sound he'd heard wasn't loud, yet hadn't matched the natural rhythm of the land. He moved toward the fence line, watching for movement across the ridges, searching for anything out of place. The tracks he'd made earlier were still visible, but nothing else disturbed the snow near the barn or the corral. His breath formed short bursts in the air as he circled the fence, scanning the tree line where shadows shifted between the pines. As he searched, a question listeners might have held lingered silently. Why would the men chasing Tala come toward this part of Wyoming at all? Harlan had avoided towns for years, and no one in nearby settlements knew he lived this far west except a few ranchers who rarely visited. If anyone was following Tala, they wouldn't know the land's layout or where a cabin might sit. But someone desperate enough to track a fleeing woman could wander close by mistake. That possibility pushed him further around the perimeter. He found the source of a noise near the western fence. A heavy pine branch had broken under the weight of last night's ice and fallen onto the rails. It hadn't caused damage, but the impact had carried enough weight to echo against the barn wall. He crouched to check the fence posts and brushed the snow from his gloves, relieved but still alert. Even though the sound had a harmless cause, he knew one truth very clearly. Tala's fear wasn't unfounded. Where she had come from, trouble followed. He returned to the cabin with slow, measured steps, giving himself time to think. Tala didn't need panic from him. She needed information and decisions made with a clear mind. Inside, Tala had remained still on the bed, clutching the quilt tightly around her shoulders while she listened for his footsteps. Her hands shook from nerves instead of cold, but she forced herself to stay composed because she didn't want him to see her fall apart. When the door opened, she drew in a sharp breath, only releasing it when she recognized his silhouette. He shut the door behind him and set the rifle aside before removing his coat. "Just a fallen branch," he said. "Nothing else." Her shoulders loosened with a relief so strong she had to close her eyes. "I thought it might be them." "I checked both sides," he said, moving the lantern to the table. "If anyone's out there, they're not close." She watched him quietly, noticing the small detail she hadn't had the presence of mind to observe earlier. The frost on his beard, the slight tension in his jaw from staying alert, the way he positioned himself so the door remained in his peripheral vision. His caution wasn't rooted in fear. It came from experience. When he finally sat in the single chair, Tala shifted forward on the bed, the oversized flannel shirt hanging loose over her dress. Her voice trembled slightly. "If they were close, what would you do?" Harlan answered without hesitation. "Keep them from getting near you." She absorbed the meaning behind his words. "Why?" she asked, not in doubt but in confusion. He met her eyes steadily. "Because no one deserves what you ran from. And because you're on my land now. That makes it my responsibility to see you through whatever's coming." That explanation filled a gap that had lingered since the first night. Why he had taken her in at all. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a quiet code he lived by, something shaped from the loss of his brother and the promise he'd once made never to stand by when someone needed help. Tala lowered her gaze, processing the weight behind his words. Her fear hadn't vanished, but something steadier replaced part of it. Trust, small but growing. She wanted to ask something else, but uncertainty held her back. Harlan noticed. "Say it," he encouraged gently, not pushing but giving her room. She hesitated before speaking. "Will they search the towns nearby?" "They'll try the busier routes first," he answered. "The trading posts, the wagon trails, the saloon roads. They'll expect you to head toward people, not away from them." "Why did you choose the opposite for yourself?" she asked, genuinely curious. For the first time since she arrived, he looked away before answering. "People cause trouble when they're close together. I learned that the hard way. Out here I can control what happens. Only thing I can't control is when danger comes from somewhere else." His honesty revealed part of what listeners might have wondered, what drove him to isolate himself so fully. Tala sensed that the cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was the place he had carved out of grief and necessity. She shifted again, pulling the quilt higher before offering him the next question, one that weighed heavily on her. "Will you let me stay long enough to recover? I don't have anywhere safe to go." He didn't need time to think. "You stay as long as you need." Her breath caught. "Even if it causes you trouble." "Trouble's already here," he said plainly. "But you're not causing it. They are." That line anchored her in a way nothing had since her escape. She sat quietly for a moment, her hands gripping the quilt tightly as heat pricked behind her eyes. She never cried in front of men, not after what she had endured, yet something about Harlan's steady presence made her feel like breaking would be allowed. She blinked the feeling away before it could surface and asked, "Do you think they'll come this far?" "If they pass through the wrong ridge, maybe," he said. "But we're not waiting to find out unprepared." He stood and retrieved a second blanket from the chest, placing it at the foot of the bed. "You'll need strength. We'll talk about what comes next when you're ready to stand." She understood the unspoken meaning behind that. She wasn't a prisoner here. She wasn't powerless. She was someone he wanted upright, armed with information, and capable of choices. Tala nodded. "I want to help if danger comes." He studied her face carefully, evaluating her resolve. "One step at a time. We'll get you strong first." Night began to settle again outside as the light dimmed through the shutters. The fire crackled softly, filling the small cabin with warmth. Tala lay back against the pillow, her breathing calm, her thoughts no longer racing the way they had the day before. Harlan moved to the stove to prepare a small meal for himself, glancing her way now and then, not hovering, but making sure she stayed grounded. Inside the cabin, two people who had lived far too long in isolation began to share the same quiet space with a sense of something new forming, something cautious, steady, and undeniable. The storm outside had passed, but the storm behind Tala had not. And for the first time since her escape, she wasn't facing alone. The snow had settled into a thick, untouched sheet by the time night fully dropped over the foothills, and the cabin grew quieter as the wind faded to a low murmur. Tala lay against the pillows with Harlan's flannel shirt hanging loosely on her frame. The quilt pulled close as she tried to process the changes the last 2 days had forced in her life. Her body still ached, but the steady warmth of the room calmed the shiver in her limbs. She watched Harlan preparing a small meal for himself at the stove, noticing how he worked with the same disciplined steadiness no matter how small the task was. The way he moved brought up another question she hadn't yet voiced: why he stayed constantly aware of every corner of the cabin, almost as if protecting the space came as naturally as breathing. He finished cutting strips of leftover meat and placed them on a tin plate before sitting in the chair near the door. He ate without hurry, keeping his eyes on the window more often than on his food. Tala recognized the behavior. She had lived in danger long enough to understand when someone was guarding a perimeter, even from inside. What she didn't know was whether he was concerned about her presence or the threat that might follow her. After he set his plate aside, she finally asked, "How far is the nearest settlement?" Harlan leaned back slightly, thinking through the question. 2 days east if weather holds. 3 if snow deepens. We're on land, most folks don't bother traveling unless they're lost or hunting. Her eyebrows pulled together. Then why build a home here? He ran his thumb along the edge of the chair arm. Needed distance. Didn't want reminders of things I couldn't fix. His tone stayed even, but Tala felt the weight behind the words. Years of regret tied to a past he had never spoken aloud to her. To fill the gap listeners might wonder about, he continued. My brother and I fought men we shouldn't have. I survived. He didn't. After that, being around people felt wrong. She understood more from that single sentence than from anything he'd said earlier. So you came here to disappear? Not disappear, he corrected softly. Just to stop hurting others by being around them. That honesty tightened something in her chest. She hadn't known that a man could choose solitude to protect others rather than himself. For the first time, she wondered whether the life he built was something he chose or something he accepted because he saw no other option. Do you ever go into town? She asked. Only when I need supplies, he answered. I don't stay long. Tala swallowed, thinking carefully before asking her next question. If the men hunting me show up in those towns, will someone tell them about you? He shook his head. Most folks barely notice me when I ride in. And even if they did, they wouldn't connect you to me unless they saw you themselves. His words eased one of the biggest uncertainties hanging over her. Out here, you're invisible to anyone but me. Her eyes drifted to the fire, comforted by the thought that she wasn't easily traceable. She considered something else listeners might wonder, what she had been doing before the men captured her. No one had asked her yet, not even Harlan. But if she was to stay here, he deserved to know the truth. I was traveling with a small group, she said quietly. 4 of us. We were trying to reach kin further south. We stopped for water near a camp, and the men there pretended to offer food. When we realized what they wanted, it was too late. Her voice tightened, but she didn't look away. We scattered. I don't know what happened to the others. Harlan's jaw flexed, the reaction subtle but unmistakable. I'm sorry that happened. She nodded once, grateful he didn't offer empty reassurances. She continued. They kept me for 2 weeks. They tied my hands at night. They tried to force me to walk with them. I watched every opening I could find until one night the cold got to them. They drank too much. They didn't guard the line properly. I ran before they woke. That filled the silence with a heavy truth. Tala wasn't just frightened. She had escaped something far more brutal than he initially realized. Harlan didn't look at her out of pity. His expression shifted into a restrained anger directed not at her story, but at the men who caused it. How far behind do you think they were when the storm hit? He asked. Less than a mile, she said. But the snow came fast. I lost sight of their fires. Then they've either turned back or stalled out trying to find tracks they can't see, Harlan said. Gives us time. She caught the word us again. Each time he used it, something inside her steadied. Harlan stood and stoked the fire higher, making sure the cabin stayed warm. Tala watched him before shifting her position and asking something that had weighed heavily since she awoke in his bed. What did you sleep last night? He looked over his shoulder. Chair, by the fire. You didn't have to, she said, her voice soft. You could have taken the bed and left me covered near the stove. I wasn't going to put you on the floor, he replied, almost offended at the idea. You were freezing. You needed the warmest spot. A small, unfamiliar warmth stirred in her chest. She wasn't used to men choosing her comfort over their own. She tightened the blanket around herself. What now? What happens tomorrow? Harlan grabbed a small piece of rope and began tying knots as he considered the question. Tomorrow, we plan ahead. You'll need clothes that fit better, and we should set up something outside to warn us if anyone comes close. He glanced at her to make sure she understood. You're not leaving this cabin until you can walk the land without collapsing. She lowered her gaze. Part of her hated feeling weak, but another part recognized that she wasn't alone in the fight anymore. I can help with small things, she said. I'm not useless. I never said you were, he replied, his tone steady. Healing is work too. Her breath caught in her throat for a moment. She hadn't expected him to recognize that survival itself took effort. A distant crack sounded outside, not close enough to cause panic, but loud enough to draw both their attention. Harlan listened for several seconds, his pulse sharpening. Ice shifting in the trees, he said finally, reassuring her with the clarity of someone who knew the land's language by sound alone. Tala exhaled slowly, still gripping the blanket with steadying hands. Will you teach me what sounds are safe and what sounds aren't? Harlan nodded. I can do that. She leaned back on the pillow, her eyes following him as he prepared another piece of wood for the fire. The cabin felt different now. Not just a shelter, but a place where knowledge, strength, and purpose were slowly being shared between two people who had been alone for too long. Harlan placed the new log into the flames, and the fire brightened the room with a warm, steady glow. Tala settled deeper into the blankets, no longer trembling. For the first time since her escape, the night didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like the beginning of something she could survive. The next morning broke with a pale, washed-out light that crept slowly across the cabin ceiling before settling on Tala's face. She stirred beneath the blankets, her body still sore but no longer icy or weak. The warmth in the room came from a fresh log burning steadily in the hearth, and she realized Harlan must have risen before her. The air carried the faint smell of brewed coffee, and she heard the soft clink of metal near the table. When she lifted her head, she saw him sharpening a small knife against a whetstone, his posture relaxed but alert, eyes flicking to the window every so often. Something inside her eased at the sight, not because he was armed, but because he looked prepared. Listeners might wonder how a man who lived alone for so long balanced caution with care, and the answer lay in the way he moved. Every motion slow, intentional, and born from years of learning what had to be watched in remote country. He wasn't restless. He was ready. You slept through the coldest part, he said without looking up. She pushed her hair from her eyes. You kept the fire going? Didn't want the place freezing, he replied, setting the whetstone aside. She sat up with more strength than she'd had the day before. The oversized flannel shirt slid across her collarbones as she adjusted it, and she caught Harlan glance away out of respect. That simple gesture confirmed something she had sensed but not fully trusted. He guarded her safety with strict boundaries of his own. Can I stand today? She asked, testing her weight by sliding one foot to the floor. You can try, he said, rising from the chair. Slowly, she shifted the blankets aside and placed both feet on the wooden floor. The cold surprised her, but it didn't steal her breath like yesterday. She stood carefully, gripping the edge of the bed. Her legs trembled at first, but she steadied them with her hand on the wall. Harlan moved closer, not to catch her, but to be within reach if she faltered. How's the balance? Better than I expected, she said, focusing on planting one step after another. Good, he said. You need to keep it steady. We're making changes today. Her eyebrows pulled together. What kind of changes? He pointed toward the window. Tracks show animals came close overnight. Deer, maybe a stray coyote. Nothing dangerous. But we need warning signs in case of something else. She understood immediately. Traps. Not for catching, he clarified. For alerting. Rattlers. Tin lines. Things that'll sound loud if someone steps wrong. Then he added something new, something that answered a question listeners might have wondered. We don't want to startle animals. Just people. Tala nodded. I can help. You can help with the indoor part, he said in a tone that left no room for argument. Cut rope, tie knots, set up lines. Her pride wanted to resist, but she recognized the practicality. Walking too far too soon could drop her in the snow again. She followed him to the table, where he slid a short coil of rope her way. Cut pieces about this long, he said, measuring with his hands. We'll tie them to the cans outside. They'll clang if anything touches them. As she worked, she asked a question she had been holding since yesterday. You said the nearest settlement was 2 days away. Do people ever pass close by? Not often, he said. Hunters sometimes. Trappers in early winter. No families this far west. You're safe as long as we stay ahead of trouble. She cut another section of rope. If those men come through the wrong ridge, they might ask around. They'll get vague answers, he said. No one knows my land. I don't take visitors. I don't trade stories. Then, with a rare hint of dry humor, he added, and I'm not exactly easy to find. That detail filled a gap listeners might ask about. How he managed to stay hidden in a territory people often crossed. The truth was he didn't avoid society because he hated it. He avoided it because he knew solitude protected everyone involved. Tala concentrated on cutting rope until a sudden realization made her pause. Harlan, she said quietly, why didn't you ask me if I had anyone looking for me in my own tribe? He looked up from the tin cans he was fitting with wires. Didn't seem right to push you. But you should know, she said, steadying herself. I'm not missing from them. I chose to leave. Mike wanted to move south. I wanted to stay near the mountains. We argued. I left alone. So no one is searching for you from your side, he said. No, she confirmed. Just the men who took me. That information changed something about the situation, a sense of finality, a clarity about why she had run so far north and why she had no place to return even if she could walk safely. They worked in silence for a moment until Harlan straightened. I'm heading out to set the first line. You stay inside. If you hear 2 knocks, it's me. Anything else, you pick up the rifle and get behind the table. The directness of the instructions revealed another question listeners might wonder about. Had Tala ever held a weapon before? She shook her head. I don't know how to fire a rifle. I'll teach you, he said. Not today, but soon. He grabbed his coat, checked the rifle, and stepped outside. Tala waited inside, listening for the crunch of snow under his boots. She breathed slowly, steadying herself, feeling stronger than she had in days, yet aware this fragile sense of safety depended on the man moving through the cold beyond the cabin. Minutes passed. Then she heard 2 deliberate knocks, his signal, and the door opened. He entered with a light layer of frost on his beard and a bundle of wire in his hands. We'll set the second line along the back, he said. Ground dips there. Someone could approach without making much noise. Tala's gaze followed him as he moved. She noticed something she hadn't before. He wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting his home, his land, and the fragile balance he'd built after years of isolation. But now that he had her inside the cabin, that balance was shifting. While he worked on the next set of cans, Tala tied the last rope pieces and surprised herself with the question that left her mouth. Do you want me here, or are you helping me because you feel obligated? Harlan looked up slowly. If I wanted you gone, you'd know. But do you want me here? She repeated, her voice steady but vulnerable. Yes, he said, without making a speech or softening the truth. I want you here. The simplicity of his answer hit harder than she expected. She felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in something warmer, something that frightened her in a different way. He moved toward the door again. Once the warning lines are up, you'll be safer walking outside. For now, stay by the fire. I'll be close." As he stepped out once more, Tala sat near the hearth, the flames reflecting against her dark eyes. Something was changing between them, something neither of them had planned. And far out on the ridge, beyond the quiet snow and the untouched land, danger moved unseen, closing distance neither of them yet sensed. By midday, the light had shifted into a clear, pale brightness that swept across the foothills and reflected sharply off the snow. Tala stood near the window, her hands resting on the sill as she watched Harlan move across the yard, testing the tension on each of the warning lines he'd strung between the fence posts. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of pine from the ridge. For the first time since arriving, she could see the land clearly, wide, quiet, and untouched except for the tracks Harlan made as he walked. She kept one hand pressed against the flannel shirt he'd given her, grounding herself in the feeling of being warm and clothed. She felt stronger this morning, able to stand on her own without gripping the bed. Still, the thought of stepping outside brought a sharp worry. What if she slowed him down? What if danger came when she wasn't ready to face it? These questions lingered in her mind until a new one surfaced. One listeners might have wondered too. Had anyone ever protected her before this? The answer, painfully simple, was no. When Harlan reached the last post, he tugged the tin line with a firm pull, and the soft metallic sound carried across the yard. Sharp enough to alert, quiet enough not to draw outside attention. Satisfied, he scanned the ridge one more time before heading back to the cabin. Tala stepped away from the window as he approached. She didn't want him to think she was watching for danger every second, even though she was. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air slipped inside. "All lines are set," he said, shrugging off his coat. "Anything walks through that yard without me knowing will hear it." Tala nodded, but her voice carried concern. "What if the men tracking me know how to move quietly? The ones who took me, they weren't loud." Harlan set the rifle on the table. "Quiet men make mistakes in deep snow, and they don't know this land like I do." He gestured toward the window. "They'll have to cross open ground to get close." The confidence in his tone eased her tension, but a deeper question rose. "If they come, will you try to scare them off or fight?" "Depends how far they push," he said without drama. "If they're looking for trouble, they'll find it." It wasn't bravado. It was the simple truth of a man who understood survival better than fear. She slid one hand along the edge of the table. "You said yesterday you'd teach me to use the rifle. Will that start today?" "Not yet," he answered. "You're steady but not ready." He motioned toward the door. "But you can step outside with me. Short walk. Stay close." That surprised her. "Outside. You need to know the land," he said. "If something happens, you can't freeze." The idea frightened her, but she knew he was right. She nodded, pulling her hair behind her shoulders and gripping the quilt around her like a shawl before following him to the door. The air outside cut cold across her cheeks, but it wasn't unbearable. Her feet sank into the snow with each step, but she didn't fall. Harlan walked slightly ahead, adjusting his pace to match her careful movements. He pointed toward the closest warning line. "See how the snow sits over that rope?" he asked. "If someone steps on it, the cans will rattle loud enough to wake anybody." She crouched slightly, inspecting the line. "You've done this before?" "Not for people," he said. "For wolves. For drifters who wandered too close in the past." Then he added something new, something he hadn't told her yet. "Had a trespasser last year. Tried stealing from the smokehouse. Lines scared him off." Tala straightened. That detail answered a lingering question, whether Harlan had faced danger alone before she arrived. He had, and he'd handled it. They walked further along the fence. Tala moved carefully, testing her balance with each step. Where breath began to catch, Harlan slowed even more. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "Wind's harsher out here. Don't push too far." "I need to," she said, determination rising in her voice. "If they come, I don't want to be someone you have to carry." His expression tightened at her words. "No one's carrying anyone unless it's life or death." She stopped walking. "You mean you expect me to fight?" "I expect you to survive," he said, meeting her eyes steadily. Those men took your power once. They won't again. Her chest tightened with an emotion she didn't fully recognize, something between fear and a growing sense of strength. She followed him to the barn wall, where he paused to show her a narrow ridge of packed snow. "If you ever need to hide," he said, pointing with his boot, "this spot keeps you covered from the road and the tree line. You'd be unseen unless someone stood right on you." Tala knelt slightly, examining the angle. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because hiding isn't the same as running," he said. "If you stay here long enough, you'll know this land the way I do. Enough to make your own choices." Her breath came out slowly, braced by his trust in her. She hadn't expected him to build a defense plan around her, not as baggage, but as someone with a role to play. A distant rustle snapped both their attention toward the trees. Harlan lifted a hand, signaling her to stay still. The noise repeated, branches shaking under something moving just beyond the fence. He stepped in front of her instinctively, not touching her, but forming a barrier. Tala's heart hammered, expecting danger, but after several seconds alone, deer stepped from the tree line, sniffing the snow. Harlan exhaled through his nose. "Just grazing." She let out a shaky breath. "Everything sounds dangerous out here." "It won't, once you learn the difference." He waited until she steadied, then gestured back to the cabin. As they walked, Tala glanced at him, observing how he kept scanning the land, even when there was nothing visible. That vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was what years of survival taught him. When they returned inside, Tala sat on the bed, breathing hard but proud she hadn't needed help. Harlan hung his coat and checked the rifle again before placing it by the door. "You handle that well," he said. "Better than I expected." "Because I didn't panic?" she asked. "Because you watched," he said. "Watching keeps you alive." She pulled the quilt tighter around her. "Do you think the men who took me are close to this part of Wyoming?" "Not yet," he said, "but they will try all directions if they think you're still alive. That's why we prepare." Her voice softened. "And you'll keep helping me?" "As long as I need to," he answered. That phrasing struck her differently than before. Not as long as she needed him, but as long as he needed to, as if she wasn't a burden, as if keeping her safe had become something he chose, not something he endured. The fire crackled softly between them, filling the room with a warm, steady rhythm that made the cabin feel less like a hiding place and more like a small, fragile beginning. And beyond the ridge, somewhere far enough not to hear, but close enough to matter, danger continued moving in their direction, slow, persistent, and unaware of the man waiting for them. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted into a pale blue that stretched cleanly above the ridge, and sunlight lingered across the snow in thin, sharp lines. Tala sat near the table, cutting lengths of rope exactly the way Harlan showed her earlier, her fingers steadier than they had been since she arrived. She glanced occasionally toward the door, listening for Harlan's footsteps as he walked the perimeter once more, testing the warning lines in case anything had shifted in the wind. Every so often she paused, sensing the faint echo of danger still on her skin. The memory of being hunted never left, even when she tried to breathe normally. When Harlan finally stepped back inside, closing the door behind him with a practiced motion that kept no draft from entering, Tala straightened slightly. His face showed no alarm, but it carried the same quiet readiness she had begun to recognize as his natural state. "Lines are holding," he said, brushing snow from his gloves. "Nothing crossed since we walked out." She set the rope down. "How far can you see from the ridge?" "Far enough to tell if someone's coming from the east trail," he answered, placing his gloves on the table. "Tracked from that direction, show one rider passed through 3 days ago. Didn't stay long." Her eyes widened. "You saw tracks earlier and didn't say?" "I wanted to be sure," he said. "And he wasn't following you." Hoof marks pointed north. That detail filled a question listeners might have wondered, whether other travelers had been nearby since Tala arrived. One had, but distance and direction proved he had nothing to do with her pursuers. Tala nodded slowly, relieved yet aware that the wilderness around them wasn't as empty as it looked. She clasped her hands together on the table. "What if more riders come through?" "Then we watch," he replied. "Not every stranger is trouble, but we don't trust any of them." He walked to the hearth and stirred the fire, sending sparks upward. Tala watched him with a growing understanding. His entire life had been shaped by the need to read danger before it reached him. She wondered how he carried that burden for so long alone. "Harlan," she said softly, "you told me where you hid when trouble came before. But what did you do after your brother died? I mean, right after?" The question surprised him. He froze for a heartbeat before straightening, his hands still warmed by the fire. "I left town before sunrise," he said. "Rode until I couldn't hold the reins." He took a slow breath. "I didn't want to look at people who knew what happened. Couldn't stand the way they watched me." "Blame?" she asked. "Some," he admitted. "Others felt sorry. Neither helped." Tala absorbed this in silence. She realized she only knew parts of the man who saved her, the quiet, controlled pieces he let her see. His decision to share something personal answered another question lingering in her mind: why he felt comfortable protecting a stranger. Because once, someone should have protected him, and didn't. "Do you ever miss having someone here?" she asked, voice low but steady. He didn't avoid the question. "Sometimes," he said, "but I didn't want to bring trouble to anyone. This land kept me from making mistakes." The honesty tightened something in her chest. She leaned back slightly, studying him. "I don't think helping me was a mistake." His eyes lifted to hers, and he nodded once, a small but deliberate gesture. "Neither do I." The cabin grew quiet, warm, and close around them. Tala shifted her feet under the blanket draped across her lap, feeling the lingering soreness in her muscles. Harlan noticed. "You're walking better," he said. "I feel different," she replied, touching her rib gently. "Stronger, I think. The food helped." "We'll keep at it," he said, returning to the table. He pulled a wooden box from the shelf above his tools and opened it, revealing several small metal pieces, a coil of wire, and a pair of pliers. Tala leaned forward. "What's all that for?" He began arranging the pieces carefully. "We're making a second kind of warning. Something with more noise if someone tries getting close to the windows." She raised an eyebrow. "Louder than the cans?" "Louder," he confirmed. "Enough to wake us both." She noticed something else then, something she hadn't fully considered before. "You're not planning for one moment," she said. "You're planning for nights ahead." "Yes," he said plainly. "Trouble rarely comes once." The truth of that statement settled deeply in her. She wrapped her arms around herself. "You think they'll find their way here eventually?" "I think men like that search until they stop breathing," he said. "But snow slows people. Distance confuses them. They don't know these hills. We do." That word again. Each time he said it, she felt the shape of her life shifting. As they worked, Tala asked a question she had avoided until now. "What will you do with them if they come?" "All of them." Harlan didn't rush his answer. He tightened a small piece of metal onto the wire and finally spoke. "I'll warn them first. Tell them to turn around. And if they don't," she pressed, "then they won't make it past the yard." His tone carried no bravado, just the firm certainty of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done to keep another person alive. She didn't fear his resolve. She trusted it more than her own escape skills. While he worked on the metal trap, Tala studied the way his shoulders shifted, the calm concentration in his eyes, the steadiness in his hands. He had built a life alone, not because he feared people, but because he feared losing them. "Harlan," she said quietly, "when you found me in the snow, what did you think I was?" He looked up from his work. "Cold. Hurt. Needed help." He shrugged gently. Didn't care about anything else. "I looked bad," she admitted, remembering her torn dress, her bruised shoulder, her cracked lips. "You looked alive," he said. That was enough. Her breath caught slightly, her throat tightening with emotion she didn't show. She looked down at the rope in her hands, steadying herself. Before she could speak again, a faint metallic rattle echoed from outside. A sharp sound carried through the still air. Harlan froze. Tala's heart jumped. He set down the wire and moved to the door with quiet determination, reaching for the rifle. Tala stood slowly, gripping the table edge to stay balanced. "Which line was that?" she whispered. "South fence," he said beneath his breath. Something stepped wrong. Animal or man. Neither of them knew yet. But both felt the shift in the air. Tala steadied herself despite the fear creeping up her spine. Harlan lifted the latch. He glanced back once, not for reassurance, but to make sure she was steady. Then he stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft, controlled click. The cold hit Harlan hard as he stepped outside, the air sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. Snow stretched quiet and untouched beneath a sky preparing for dusk. He paused just beyond the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, rifle held steady in both hands. The warning line near the south fence swayed gently, still trembling from whatever had disturbed it. Tala stood inches behind the door on the other side, holding her breath as she listened. The silence pressed into the cabin walls, heavy and expectant. For a moment, she feared the men who had taken her had arrived, that the snow had carried them here sooner than either of them hoped. Listeners might have wondered the same, how dangerous the men were, how determined, how close they could have come. What she didn't know yet was that Harlan had anticipated this moment long before she woke in his bed. He moved toward the south fence with careful, controlled steps. His boots left deep marks, the only new tracks in the yard. As he approached the line, he crouched low, inspecting the snow. He didn't see boot prints. He didn't see anything shaped like a person's weight shifting through the yard. What he saw instead was a trail of small indentations moving from the tree line toward the fence, then circling back into the brush. A fox. He let out a slow breath and lowered the rifle slightly, his tension easing but not fully gone. The animal had passed through, curious maybe, hungry surely, but harmless. Still, the warning line had done its job. Anything larger would have made more noise. Anything human would have left a mark. He stood there for a moment, scanning the tree line one last time before turning back to the cabin. Inside, Tala waited with her hand pressed firmly against the doorframe. When the latch clicked, she moved aside quickly, watching him enter with the rifle low, but ready if needed. "Just a fox," he said, locking the door behind him. Tala exhaled shakily, the relief spreading through her shoulders. "I thought it was them. They're not close yet," he said. Tracks would show it. She looked down at her hands, realizing she was still gripping the table edge so tightly her knuckles were white. When she let go, they tingled with leftover tension. "I don't think I'll ever stop expecting them." "You will," he said, "when your mind finally believes what your eyes see. That takes time." She lifted her gaze, absorbing the meaning behind his words. He wasn't dismissing her fear. He was acknowledging it as something real, something that needed patience, not correction. Harlan set the rifle on the wall hook and moved to stoke the fire. Tala crossed the room slowly, feeling steadier with each step, and sat on the edge of the bed. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, breathing through the leftover fear from the alarm. "Harlan," she said quietly, "what will you do if the men find this place? Truly find it, not just pass nearby." This question lingered for listeners too. What exactly Harlan intended, how far he would go to protect her, and whether he had a plan beyond warnings and traps. He didn't hesitate. "I'll end it," he said. "Quick, certain. They won't get another chance to hurt you." She looked at him for a long moment, studying the man who had changed her fate. "And after that," he said, "you decide what you want your life to look like." The answer surprised her. She expected him to speak about rebuilding or staying hidden or moving somewhere safer. Instead, he placed the decision entirely in her hands. "You think I'll be able to decide anything?" she asked softly. "Once they're gone?" "You will," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." She lowered her head, a wave of emotion rising unexpectedly. "I don't know what I want yet." "You don't have to," he said. "Not today." The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting warm light across the room. Tala felt the warmth reach her bones, easing the tension that had taken hold since the sound on the warning line. After a quiet moment, she asked something she had been afraid to voice. "Before you found me, what did you see in the snow that made you come running?" Harlan considered the question before answering, offering a detail listeners might have wondered, why he reached her in time. "Your tracks were different," he said. "Staggered. Too light and too deep in the wrong places. Someone injured or freezing walks like that. I knew you didn't have much time." Tala swallowed hard. "So you followed the pattern?" "I followed the fight," he corrected gently. "You were refusing to stop. I recognized it. She leaned back, understanding what he meant. A person who gave up left a different trail than someone who pushed until they collapsed. Harlan had seen the difference long before she saw him. He moved to the table and sat across from her. The room felt smaller, warmer, not with tension, but with something new, something slowly building between them in the space created by trust. Tala, he said, there's something else we need to discuss. She straightened slightly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What is it? You're staying, he said simply. Not because you're trapped, not because you can't run. You're staying because this land is safer for you than any trail leading back to what you escaped. She absorbed the words carefully. And you're certain? I am, he said, but I won't lock the door behind you. Whatever you choose, I'll stand by it. Her breath caught, a small quiver that she steadied with a deep exhale. I don't want to leave, she admitted. Not now, not after everything. His jaw softened, the slightest shift but noticeable. Then you won't. Silence settled between them. Not the fearful kind, not the awkward kind, but the quiet that came from understanding something was changing. As the firelight warmed the room, Tala looked down at her hands and spoke the words she hadn't dared believe she could say. Harlan, I'm late. He froze, not in fear, but in a way that told her he understood immediately what she meant. How long? He asked, voice steady but carrying a deep shift beneath it. Long enough to know, she whispered. Before they took me. Before everything. I didn't realize until yesterday. Harlan didn't move for several seconds, his eyes locked on hers. Then he rose slowly, approached her, and knelt so he could see her face clearly. You're sure? He asked. She nodded. Yes. His breath left him in a slow, stunned exhale. He sat beside her, placing one hand gently on the bed, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the warmth. So, it's not just you I'm protecting now, he said quietly. No, she whispered. It's both of us. He stayed still, letting the truth sink into the room. Their small cabin, their isolated land, their fragile safety, all of it had changed with one shared moment. Finally, he spoke again, his tone firm but carrying a gentle weight. Then we do this together. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Tala leaned into him, resting lightly against his shoulder. He lifted an arm slowly, letting it settle around her in a way that felt steady and real. Outside, the land remained quiet. Inside, a future neither expected began taking shape. Solid, warm, and free from fear. And for the first time since she collapsed in the snow, Tala felt certain. She had found a home.